Let me give you this one, because I thought this is this is the Stephen Spoonamore call to action, essentially. Here is an email, and I've gotten a few of these, but here is one example. Please disseminate, Mark, this duty to warn letter, the hacking of election 2024. This is from Stephen Spoonamore, his advice to VP Harris. Quoted from that, you should reverse your concession, call for both a full investigation of criminal activity, and demand hand recounts in all 7 swing states. By the way, I've said, what's the problem with that? I don't see why you shouldn't get that. I mean, again, it's the cost is minuscule compared to what you are actually talking about, which is the rise, as you say, Kamala Harris, of despotism and fascism, et cetera. If it's that intense a situation, you'd think it would demand a basic recount, just a hand recount, just to make sure that all the paper ballots match the numbers. So she then pushes on this entire duty to warn letter, but it's pretty long. I'll read a couple of paragraphs for you just to give you the sense of it. But this is this guy, Stephen Spoonamore. I played a little bit from an interview that he gave the other day. He says, professionally, I've worked as the CEO or CTO at 7 high-technology firms, including 2 of which specialized in hacking and counter-hacking operations. My clients have included numerous governments, DOD, DHS, Department of State, F-100 Financials, and F-500 Industrials. I'm a lifelong Republican who has long placed service and participatory democracy over party. In government, I have twice been invited to SOCOM to give lectures on electronic warfare and techniques to find terrorist money laundering, and gave a keynote speech at the National Counterland Summit on this same topic. I've served as an after-action reviewer of communications and data failures on 9/11 under the direction of Jim Woolsey and the FDNY, etc. He goes on, you should reverse your concession, Kamala Harris. Call for both a full investigation of criminal activity and demand hand recounts in all 7 swing states. In my professional view, he continues, there are multiple and extremely clear indications the presidential vote was willfully compromised. I wholly agree, he says, with the public letter of Duncan Buell and everyone of November 13th, stating that they believe there's a possibility of hacking, and they call for hand recounts. This letter's clear call to action is commendable, but its cautious tone may belie the severity of what I believe has happened, he goes on. In my view, it is a near certainty the results have been changed at a scale which reversed the U.S. presidential election. They imply there is a chance a hand recount will show you won more votes, you, Kamala Harris. I'm stating a hand recount will most likely show you did win. Both these letters call on you to act, he says. Let me get you to the way in which it worked. The results of the attack are improbable in the extreme and well-tailored to the sole benefit of your opponent. And I'll read this and then we'll move on. But I want you to, and by the way, I'm going to continue here and then I'm going to give you an opposing argument, if you will, not on the technical side, but on the real way in which Trump and his minions and those who worked with Trump to get him back into office could legitimately, with old school politics meeting new technologies, but not a hack, have won the election. But let's continue with this. This he's talking about as a hack, an electronic hack. Approximately 600,000 votes are for Donald Trump, but with no down ballot choices. These are either inserted bullet ballots for the presidential race or manipulated data fields. Remember, the bullet ballot is just one vote that goes to one candidate, and that's all that's on the ballot. There are bullet ballots in every election, but when the number of bullet ballots exceeds in wildly high numbers the number of bullet ballots in a typical election, it should give you reason for pause. That's my opinion, not here in the letter, but let's continue. These are either inserted bullet ballots for the presidential race or manipulated data fields, he says. They are surgically added to totals in limited jurisdictions and with only the 7 swing states this happened. This historically unprecedented set of numbers found in the 2024 swing states is absent in every other state. In Arizona, Michigan, North Carolina, and Wisconsin, the effect of these drop-off votes reverses the voters' will and, even more improbably, always pushes the winning margin beyond the mandatory recount numbers. It is a result too perfect for belief. It is a bespoke and programmed outcome, he says. In other states, including Pennsylvania and Nevada, removing these strange and bespoke added votes, it appears Donald Trump may have won the cast votes, but within a margin of error which would force recounts. The inserted votes raise his totals to avoid any scrutiny during mandatory recount results, which would have slowed his claim on the presidency. In Georgia and Florida, the same pattern exists, with unclear impact on the results. This attack is not technically difficult. It is modest in scale. It would require modest and common computer programming skills, access to 10 to 100 tabulators, or to the handful of facilities programming them in advance, a credible database of voter IDs of non-voters around which to create false ballots, perhaps as few as 1, but more likely 3 to 5 humans to program this entire thing. Access to e-bowl book data during the election to determine who had not voted, and possibly human access to some tabulators during counting. The tell, he says, a historically absurd number of Trump-only bullet ballots or undervote ballots. There are always a handful of voters who cast a vote in one race, which they care about, and do not make other selections on the ballot. These are called bullet ballots, what we were talking about before. In presidential races since 1980, these bullet ballots rarely account for more than 1% of the total votes, including in Mr. Trump's winning of the 2016 election and losing of the 2020 election. And when they do it, it warrants further investigation when they show up in bigger numbers. In 2024, in the 43 non-swing states, bullet ballots make up a nominal 1% approximately. In the 7 swing states, the numbers are so high to be unbelievable, he says, unprecedented, and demanding of further investigation. And then he goes on to analyze in Arizona, in Nevada, in Oregon, in Utah, in Idaho. He points to some sort of baseline, and it goes on and on. This is a lengthy statement from Spoonamore. But I mention it and read it because I want to give you guys who have inundated me with this some sense that I agree that I don't necessarily agree that the election was hacked. I don't know. I agree that there are enough red flags that I think a hand recount and asking for a hand recount is an absolutely legitimate ask. I don't know why it hasn't happened. It is too late now in Nevada. It's too late also, I think, in one other state. But I do believe the revelations that could come from a hand ballot recount would be so stunning so as to get everybody's attention and perhaps call into question the legitimacy of this last election. Now, again, you can quarrel with those numbers. You can quarrel with that narrative. And I understand that being an election denier or being, now you fall into the category of those 2020 Trumpers who, everything's a fix, the deep state was in it. I always hear about the deep state from the right and from the Trumpies. If the deep state is so powerful, how did your guy win? The deep state is in control of the Democrats, I thought. They're certainly, they have control of the presidency. In any case, I believe that it's appropriate to at least ask for a hand recount. But it's not going to happen. Kamala Harris is, I think, still in Hawaii right now. Not that it would matter where she is, but I think that that is also where her head is, which is, hey, I gave it my best shot. I did everything I could. Meantime, if you're not someone who signs on to that, you may offer a modicum of respect to a GOP plan under Donald Trump that was different to win this election than other GOP strategies that they've employed to win the election and other, frankly, political strategies that have existed in the past. Here's a little piece of a Charlie Kirk interview in which he talks about the work they were doing on behalf of Trump to harvest and find a certain set of voters and to try to get them motivated to show up, to change essentially the way in which the party looked at the voters that they needed to get to the polls. Go ahead, Albert.
Registering to vote, we're registering at a clip 3-1 versus Democrat. In Pennsylvania, for the first time ever, in Pennsylvania, for the first time ever, we had every county in Pennsylvania, we were out registering Democrats for the first time ever. Now, mind you, what Josh Shapiro did as governor of Pennsylvania is he put in a thing called motor voter, which means you automatically get registered to vote. They thought that was going to help Democrats.
When you get your license.
When you get your driver's license. It helped Republicans because of lower, think about who's not registered to vote. It's typically lower propensity voters and PBD. Here's the kicker. Where do these people get their information? Lower propensity voters get information on TikTok. Mm-hmm. They're not watching CNN. They're not sitting. You know why? These folks are darn tired by the time they get home. They're not turning on cable news. They're watching NFL football games. Mm-hmm. They're the ones that are not going to be able to quote to you, Marbury. They're not.
Strategy.
By the way,
it's also this.
Yeah, it's also the phone. So what Donald Trump campaign did is they hacked the 2024 election, not in a way that people would think, where they said, wait a second, everyone has a supercomputer in the right-hand pocket. Why are we worried about what CNN is saying or MSNBC is saying? Why don't we win the information war? And then finally, the kicker, they said, why don't we go on the most ambitious, over-the-top, low-propensity voter communication strategy on Theo Von, Joe Rogan, Nelk Boys, Logan Paul, influencer strategies, right? And so what they said is there's this whole reservoir. And the final kicker, my mandate at Turning Point was very simple. Charlie, turn Trump supporters into voters. And that's what we did.
Yeah. Boom. So that's, I thought that was an interesting summary of a non-hack plan, okay, that didn't involve, we're going to get Elon Musk to manipulate data, and a strategy that they did employ. And they showed up in big numbers, those men. Luis says, are we going to go through the it was rigged thing every single election now? We are stuck with the QVC king. Let's just move forward. Hashtag no J6 for Dems. I mean, I get that position, Luis. That's what I was saying before, that the protestations associated with the election kind of put you in the category of the 2020 J6ers or whatever. But that said, I do think if you see something that doesn't make sense, you have to call it out. And I don't think a hand recount is that big a deal. I'm not saying take to the streets. I'm simply saying, recount. And again, as I've told you, I'm a skeptic. I don't necessarily believe it was hacked. I don't know. But I do think that there are enough questions, and there are enough questions among Americans that just as a service to Americans, be fair, you should ask for the recount. So it's not expensive. You could raise the money easily to actually get these recounts underway.
I know polls can be wrong, but one of the things that Charlie Kirk was saying in that video was that they went out and targeted younger voters. And all the polls showed, I thought from my memory, that it was that Kamala Harris had younger voters in the bag. I mean, that overwhelmingly younger voters were supporting her.
Well, I mean, I don't know about overwhelmingly. I mean, in swing states, I think it depended what swing state you were talking about. Mm-hmm. I believe, for example, in Michigan, younger voters didn't go up for Kamala Harris, right? Mm-hmm. Because of the Gaza thing, they were quite either committed to not voting, or they voted for Jill Stein or a third party. But I'd have to go back and look at those numbers again. I think it's clear that among young men, Donald Trump was dominant. And basically what Charlie Kirk was saying is, we decided that we were going to make this election about getting those people who were already on board to actually show up. And I don't want to make that sound like that's reinventing the wheel, because we talked about that here. Those people, Democrats have to show up, and the ground game is so good, et cetera. But what he talked about there that I liked, and I don't like Charlie Kirk particularly, obviously, and we have pretty much nothing we could agree on, but what I think we do agree on is that it's about messaging. I talk about it all the time on this show. You know, the issues that you vote on, the issues that you find important, are dependent on many of the messages and much of the news that you get. So if you do get your news from TikTok, if you can dominate the TikTok space, if you do get your news from podcasts, if you can dominate the podcast space, if you get your news from whatever, if you can dominate the whatever, you begin to define the narrative. And I think the Republicans did that quite well. So people somehow forgot about the chaos or were ready to overlook the chaos of the first Trump administration. And now they're going to get reminded. And a guy who has no real plans for the economy somehow got away with just complaining about inflation and the economy and saying it's the worst economy ever, et cetera, when he had really no follow-ups as to what he was going to do besides tariffs. And the media played ball with that. They roasted Kamala Harris, demanding from Kamala Harris some kind of plan, some kind of economic strategy, et cetera, but they didn't make those same demands on Donald Trump. There was an absolute asymmetry about the way the media treated Donald Trump and the way they treated Kamala Harris. I mean, Donald Trump doesn't have a plan on anything, but they let him get away with, we're going to end the war in Ukraine in the first day. Probably, I don't even have to be in office. I'll end it in 24 hours with a phone call. Yeah. I mean, but this is just stuff, that soundbite was allowed to ride. Meanwhile, Kamala Harris had to, go through these withering interviews on 60 Minutes. Why isn't she meeting with more legitimate media? While Donald Trump went for back rubs on Fox and Friends and on Joe Rogan and as Theo Vaughn, et cetera. So you end up with all of these things, of course, contributing to a Trump victory. And you could look at all of those things as legitimate, if you will, ways that the messaging, the media, and the candidate all contributed to the Kamala Harris loss and the Donald Trump victory. But I don't accept or carve out any other conspiracy scenario as ridiculous until there is a recount. So always in the back of my mind, I'll wonder, because I don't think there will be a recount. I think most clearly there won't be. Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.